Thank you for coming. Today's presentation. Today's presentation is on the history of whaling in New Bedford, and Geri Taylor is here to tell us all about it. Thank you.
Not only New Bedford, I'm going to talk about Lakeville because this is the focus on Lakeville. So I have a few little tidbits of information about Lakeville and its relationship to whaling. Okay, I'd like to start by telling you how I got interested in this. I grew up in New Bedford. At the age of 11, I moved to Dartmouth and graduated from Dartmouth High. So I grew up in that area that was known as the city of lights that lit the world. Mm-hmm. And my father would carve whales from when I was little, and he would take a piece of wood, a block of wood, and he would shape it into the whale and paint them. And he also took a rough whale's tooth and he would sit there and wet sand it and polish it. And he would make things like paperweights, bookends, pins. Never got into Scrimshaw. He died at the age of 42 and I was 14. And I think if he had lived, I would have learned how to do this, and he might have learned Scrimshaw. He was an embalmer at Williams Funeral Home at 1 Washington Square in New Bedford. And Mr. Williams made it in the brown section of the Standard Times, New Bedford Standard Times, all about his whaling, his whale craft, shall we say. And he taught my father everything he knew. And that's what I wish he had done to me, you know. So I'd like to share this. I was also an elementary school teacher, and when I did my student teaching at the Burnell School at Bridgewater State, first grade, I did my first whaling unit. I had to really drop it down to their level, but then I did it again in fourth grade when I taught at Assawamsett School. And my sister has borrowed all my stuff and taught it. She was a teacher too. And so I've got it in my head and I'm going to try and do it without notes. So let's begin. I don't know if you know this, but whales were a land mammal millions of years ago. They had legs. They had hair to protect them from the brush that they would have to walk through searching for food. They had teeth, top and bottom. They had an earlobe like ours to protect from dirt getting into their ears. They had an eyelid like we do over their eyes, okay? They had a nose that protruded so that they could breathe. They had lungs like we do to breathe the air. Over millions of years, they needed food, so they would go out into the ocean and find fish and shellfish and different things to eat. So gradually, they lost their hair and became very streamlined as they swam around. They lost their front legs. Well, their front legs became flippers. I hope this all sticks. And their back legs were practically eliminated, but, whoops. That's one thing I forgot to bring was my double-sided tape. They have still found bones where the hips would have been in whales even of today. They have evolved to very small, but they are signs that they had 4 legs, hind legs.
When did they develop the flipper? The back thing?
Oh, the flukes?
What do you call it?
Flukes.
Flukes.
Okay. They became like a fish, except, okay, let's see. Okay, 2 more things. Their eye lost its lid, and from being in the water, they developed oily tears, greasy tears that made a film over their eyes so that they could swim underwater. They lost their earlobe. It's just a little hole because sound travels easier in water. So I'm sure you've heard of echolocation, how sound waves in water can bounce off of something and come back. That's how they navigate. That's how they figure out where they, where the squid are, where the schools of fish are, is from echolocation. Gradually, because they had lungs, they had to surface to get oxygen from the air. They couldn't get oxygen from the water, so they had to surface. So gradually, their nose moved to the top. And now, sorry. Now they have a blowhole that we see when we go whale watching. You see the spout coming up, okay? So that's that one. Okay, now we're going to talk about the differences. A fish is a fish, but a whale is a mammal. Fish have gills. Whales have lungs. They have greasy tears too that protect their eye. They have a fin, a flipper, if you want to call it. On a whale, it's a flipper. Okay. Notice the different size of the dorsal fin. Now, on a fish, the flukes are vertical, and they move it side to side. That's how they move, okay? But a whale has flukes, and it moves up and down, and that's what propels them forward. They have very strong fibers in their muscles, in the flukes, to propel this big body forward. Okay, let's see. Now, streamlined, their little ear, the water doesn't get in. They have the muscles to close their ear when they sound go under the water. Their blowhole, of course they're swimming underwater. They can close that up too with their muscles around the blowhole, but when they surface, they need to expel any moisture. So that's what you see. They're warm from their body being warm. Their spray really goes out into the water and evaporates, and it looks like a cloud or a spray. Okay? All right. I'm trying to do this because I want to fit this all in an hour. Okay. Now, there are two different kinds of whales. The toothed whale and the baleen whale. Now, they needed teeth when they were living on land to catch animals and chew, okay? As they evolved, some whales kept their teeth, but others developed baleen. Baleen is made of the same material, keratin, that your fingernails are made out of. It's very bendable, okay? And what happens is, of course, the toothed whale will eat squid, sharks, and I read that they swallow them whole sometimes. So all the bones go right into their stomach and are expelled. We'll talk about that later. But the baleen whale has the baleen, which hangs from the top of their mouths. And as you can see, it's kind of, feathered like. And what they do is they have this big lower folds in their skin, and they, as they swim along with their mouths open, they swim into a school of fish, and then they close their mouths, and they have huge tongues that push against the baleen, and because it's strips, okay, and feathered, the water goes out and all the fish stay in and they swallow it, okay? So, and what they eat are plankton, real microscopic creatures, and sometimes it's called krill. And they have to eat a lot of it to satisfy their huge size. So they swim all day getting the krill or the plankton of small fish and pushing up with their tongues. And that's a lot of work. They burn a lot of calories, but they work hard to get what they have. Okay? All right. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk to you about how whaling developed, okay? Before the Pilgrims ever came to our country, the Native Americans lived here, and they started seeing whales beached for whatever reason, They called it drift whaling. That's when they would drift ashore and they would slice it up and eat the meat. I don't know exactly when they figured out that it was oil and they burned it, but they used it mainly for tools, their bones for tools and food. Okay, then shore whaling. The natives would have their machoons, their boats that they made, what was it made out of now? Bark and log? Oh, yes, they burned the log to make the canoe, and they would use their bows and arrows and spears, harpoons. We probably wouldn't call them harpoons until later, but they called them spears. And they would row as fast as they could close to the whales that would come in looking for warm water. and they would tie a log to their spear so that it would slow the whale down, okay? And how they did it then, I have no concept of how hard they had to work to get that whale to tire enough to tow it onto shore and cut it up and eat it, okay? Then, of course, as they found the whale oil was a better way to make light, okay? So they would have the whale ship. They had the ships, they made them into whale ships, and they would let down the whale boat, and the harpooner would pierce the whale, and sometimes it stuck and sometimes it didn't. And when it did stick, they had to be very wary of whether the whale was going to sound, go down into the water, you know. They had to wait until it came up again for air, and then they would try to spear it again. And if it stuck, they could be pulled for many miles to before the whale tired enough for them to tow it to shore, or tow it back to the whale ship. That was called the Nantucket sleigh ride, because Nantucket was one of the first places that whale ships left from to capture whales for the purpose, the commercial purpose of getting oil for their lamps. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let me see this here. Okay. They developed the whale boat that would be hung from davits on the whale ship. And there were 6 members of the crew that would go out on a whale boat to hunt the whales. There was a mast that they would first go into to get near the whale, okay? And they had 4 oarsmen, I guess you would say, and then they had the boat steerer who would, with the rudder and his oar, he would direct the whaleboat to a whale. They also had the harpooner, and the harpooner would change places with the boat steerer, and through all of this equipment, okay? There were the seats, and this seat over here was so that the harpooner had little cutouts for his knees to support him as he threw the harpoon. So they would switch many times, okay, in the search for the whales. When it was time for the harpooner to harpoon the whale, he attached his harpoon to some rope which was tied to the loggerhead, and there were 2 buckets of coiled rope, and he had to have a cask of seawater to scoop up and throw on the rope in those tubs because the friction might start a fire with the rope. So when they got down to the smaller bucket of rope, he knew that he had to pour water on it and that he was closer. He was closer to the whale. And he better do something before he runs out of rope, okay? Now, this is a piggin, and that was used to scoop up water. If the whale came close and the waves came over, they had to get the water out of the boat. They also had fresh water for them to drink in a wooden cask, and they also had a lamp bucket to keep the food that they never knew how long they were going to be out there. So they would have food and lighting, lamps in there, something like this. And okay, so the harpooner harpoons the whale, and he it's not like Moby Dick where you get all tangled up in the rope and die. But he would harpoon the whale. Now, there were two kinds of harpoons. Okay? This harpoon was the early harpoon, and as you can see, it's sharp, it's shaped so that if the whale tries to pull out, maybe it would stay stuck in his skin, in his blubber, to take hold. But then in New Bedford, a blacksmith invented, his name was Lewis Temple. And this is called the temple talk because you would go into the whale and there would be a wooden dowel that would break and the point would go sideways, and that was a better way of it staying in the whale blubber. Okay, so that's a temple tog harpoon. Okay. Yeah, it was quite an adventure. Okay, all right. Now, of course, the possibility of a dead whale or a stove boat was very likely to happen. Hopefully not, but at the outside of the New Bedford Public Library, this statue is there, and that's what it's called, a dead whale or a stove boat, because a stove boat is one that the whale won and crashed into the boat, and everybody went flying. Some died, some survived, but it was a very dangerous job. This might be a good time to tell you about Lakeville ties with the whaling industry. There was a man named Isaac Sampson who made shoes, and out of leather he made shoes for the whalers to wear on the ship that would not slip and slide. Because once they started trying out the whale, it was very gory, shall we say. I think they called it Corey something, I can't remember right now. But they would be knee-high in the remains of the whale. And of course, the blubber was prized. Let's see. First, I want to tell you the basic things about a whale ship. Can you see?
Yep.
Okay. They had the captain's quarters. They had the galley. Now, the galley was interesting because around the edge of the table, they would have a raised edge so that if they were in rough seas, they wouldn't lose their plate. It would slide to the sides and not off the table. Okay, so that was a way of preventing loss of their dishes and their food. Then you had the officers' quarters, and they had to share. There was usually a first mate, a second mate, a third mate, and a fourth mate. And they would be the boat steerers that I told you would lead the whaleboat to the whales. And so they had a little better quarters than the people, the regular oarsmen and other workers on the ship that lived in the forecastle at the stern of the ship. Okay, they had food storage, and then of course plenty of room for the casks once they tried the blubber into oil. Now, they had the try-works, which was made of iron. First, they had sheets of iron that were attached to the ship. And then inside, they would make the brick, and they would fill that with seawater so that the ship wouldn't catch on fire when they built the fire in there. So on this side would be iron doors that they could build the fire, open it, and get the fire started. And with the big vat inside of it. And then because they were working so closely, they could close those iron doors and they would protect them from the heat. Okay? Now, when they caught a whale, okay, they used the windlass, which was a big cylinder, probably as long as the width of this room, and it would have a chain around it, lots and lots of feet of chain, and that's what they used to hoist the whale once they got the whale. Okay, and there was a blubber hook that they would pierce into the whale's blubber, and then they would cut a blanket sheet. So they would cut around with a boat spade, and I forgot to show you that. The boat spade was, they would cut a hole, once they captured the whale, they would cut a hole in it, and they would put a rope through the head and tow it back to the whale ship. Of course, if they caught a whale and there were other whales in the area and they wanted to go after those whales, they had like a flag called a waif that they would stick into the whale, and they were color-coded, or they had their symbol on it, painted on it, or embroidered on it. that the women would make to identify that that whale belonged to that ship. So no one else, you know, you have to be honest. So they would stick the blubber hook in, and then they would cut a big piece out, lift it with the blubber hook, and then they would cut the other side out, and those blanket pieces would be sliced into horse pieces, okay? Pieces about maybe that big, and then they would mince them and they call them Bible leaves, look like pages in a book, okay? And once it got to this part, they could put it into the tripod and boil the blubber. And then they would have a skimmer that any pieces of skin that didn't melt down, they could skim any imperfections out. And then they would bale it, okay, into casks of wood. Now, a lot of the workers on a whale ship were not just the harpooners and the men who went out to capture the whale. There were coopers to make the barrels. They were just strips of wood, and to take less room, they wouldn't make them into barrels until they needed them. So the cooper's job was to put the staves, shape them, and put the iron metals around them to make them into barrels. And so that was one job. Another job were all the men who had to do these jobs, you know, cutting the blanket pieces and cutting the horse pieces and cutting the Bible leaves, and then there were specialty people who, if it was a sperm whale. Now the sperm whale has the biggest head, okay, right here. And inside this area was they called it a case, and a special kind of oil was in a case in the head of this whale. And it was found to be a white, clear substance that when it cooled, it turned into a wax. And by dipping a wick into that wax, it would have a smokeless candle. Before that, they would use, you know, pig and tallow and different kinds of waxes, but they would burn black and the ceilings would be black and everything. So this was a very special thing, and it sold very well in to light the world. The other thing about sperm whales is because they were eating squid and larger fish and sharks and everything, their stomachs could not digest the bones. So that would upset their stomachs. They would have indigestion and they would vomit. And the vomit would be floating in the water, and the whalers would gather that. And what they found was that it made perfume's fragrance last longer. Out of the vomit. The spermaceti they also found was a good oil for watches and for delicate machinery when the, you know, the sewing machines were being developed and everything like that. Unfortunately, or fortunately for the whale, in 1859, petroleum was discovered. And instead of using whale oil, they began to make kerosene out of petroleum, and that's what they lit their homes with. That, of course, this was gradual, you know, because whaling went on until like 1927, and it wasn't until the 1960s or 70s when laws were made that to protect the whales that were becoming extinct. So that was a very important step in reducing whaling. Now the Japanese and the Eskimos and the Scandinavians, they used whale blubber as food. It was their mainstay in their diet. So they when it became a law to protect the whales, those three groups of people were still allowed to catch whales, but it wasn't an industry anymore. You know, they had to, you know, like the right whale. Excuse me. The right whale. As you can see, he's big and bulky, and his friend, the bowhead whale, they were big and bulky, and that made them the right whale to catch. You know, they were slower, they couldn't get away as fast, so the right whale and the bowhead whale were becoming extinct because they were so easy to catch. Okay. So let's see. Okay. This is my last thing here. Okay, whale products. Blubber was used for food by the Japanese, the Scandinavians, and even Hawaiians, and they still use blubber for food. The whale oil gave better light for the oil lamps. Whale's teeth. What did the whalers do when they were waiting to sight a whale? They did scrimshaw. And what they did was they sanded the whale, and with a sailmaker's needle, they would draw a picture, carve out a little picture. Then they would rub soot into the grooves and clean it, and that's what they did. And they would do their wives' faces, they would do other ships, they would do a whale hunt. They tell a story. Okay? Out of the whale bone, okay, here's a piece of whale bone, very heavy. It was very useful in making tools. They made pie crimpers, they made rolling pins for their wives, they made stays for their undergarments, all different kinds of things. My sister has the little wine set. It was a plate with carved edges, and then each little goblet, I don't know how they did it, but it was like having a router and doing the stem of the glass, all this fancy work. and then the wine cask. It's only about this high, so you weren't gonna get drunk on this little wine cask, but very ornate. I would like to think that a real whaler had made it, years ago, and my father bought it from someone. I told you he was an embalmer, a funeral director, and I think instead of getting paid in money, he would barter, things that he was interested in, And the spermaceti, I told you about the special oil in the case, the head case of the sperm whale, and how it made smokeless candles, and the ambergris that prolonged the fragrance of perfume. All right, I guess that's it. Any questions? Yes, Devaney?
You were starting to mention about Lakeville's.
Oh, yes, okay. Also, Alicia Cudworth. I don't know if you know where the Cudworth house is. It's on Bedford Street, 416, and it's on part of 18 and 105 that you see a stone wall and a long driveway going up to this beautiful place up on the top of the hill. The Cudworths lived there. First it was the Nelsons, and I think Samuel Nelson and his son William, and then it was the Cudworths. Now this was in the middle of the 1800s, and he was a whaler. That, the family started out in New Bedford, but he was going on 2-year, 3-year, 4-year whaling hunts, and so he decided he wanted his family to be brought up away from the city, and he wanted his wife to be self-sufficient. So he bought this house in Lakeville, and it might have even been before Lakeville became Lakeville, 1853. And she had her garden, she had chickens for food, she had sheep to make cloth, and she did become quite self-sufficient. And then, of course, when he came home, he had a nice place to go to, And another man was Andrew Shockley. He took many trips to the Arctic, to Cape Horn, looking for whales, and he would be gone. Now, I want you to know that there was another whaler, John H. Pond, not his son, but John Pond went on whale trips too, and one of his ships was named Anaconda. Another ship was named Pantheon. Another ship was named Massachusetts. Streets in Lakeville. Shockley Drive. The street was named after him. Then Mr. Pond married a Coombs woman, and so there's Coombs Avenue, Coombs Street, or Street, and so a lot of the streets in Lakeville are named after important people, you know. You know, I don't know if you know where Anaconda and Pantheon in Massachusetts are, but it's off of West Vaughan Street and Captain's Way. Okay, so when his family sold the property, they named the streets after the ships that he was on. You know, so that was a little bit of Lakeville history. I haven't completed research on finding out how Lakeville was involved in the whaling industry, but I'm still working on it. So as I find things, I'll let you know. Other questions?
Yeah, the whale bone.
Oh,
What kind did it come from? What is it?
okay.
I
This
can't
is,
imagine you want that.
well, this was my father's. He died in 1962, and that was before everything was outlawed to own this.
I didn't mean you had to move it, I just wanted. Wow.
Now, this was a small whale. This was probably a baby or maybe a blackfish or a killer whale or something. But all these grooves, they had anywhere from 20 to 40 teeth in the two parts of their jaw. And
Oh, so that's part of the jaw.
this is the jaw.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the jaw. I also have a whale rib, but I figured a whale rib is a whale rib.
Right.
Yeah, and of course it's been
Mouthful.
bounced and everything, yeah.
And really,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay,
Where do you keep that, Geri?
over my garage.
Don't ever move.
Anyone else have a question?
Yes,
Yes,
you
do.
mentioned the Scrimshaw.
Yes.
How can you tell today that something is really Scrimshaw?
It would have to be very old, because after the law came to save the whales,
Well, are there certain marks, like would there be carvings on the whale bones that they did? How would you tell the difference between the Scrimshaw on the whale bone and, let's say, plastic?
oh, you'd tell just by the weight, I'm sure.
And also
by the
hot needle.
weight.
Yeah.
And the fine,
But there's a Scrimshaw Society, and they catalog whose boat it was, who the carver was, how old it was, who's holding it now. There's a whole, not only just a society, but they do a magazine. And all of those things are listed because there are so many fakes.
Well, several years ago, and I mean several, someone gave me a piece of Scrimshaw for my bracelet. And I often wondered whether it was real or whether it was,
You could probably, Google the Scrimshaw Society and probably write to them or email them, and they'll probably let you know. Because that's what they do, they catalog all of that. And then, of course, the Whaling Museum, I don't know if it's every year, but they have a course on Scrimshaw and Scrimshaw collecting at the Whaling Museum.
I mean, if someone tells you that they have a Scrimshaw piece about this big, it's not from a whale. It's either a tusk of an elephant, or a horn of a rhino, or, you know, something, some other animal. But I'm sure, I don't know if they would call it Scrimshaw even if it were.
Now, the literal definition is
Just
by,
whale.
right, on a whaleboat by a whaler in a certain period of time.
I got this from Scrimshaw, 1974.
1970.
And he wrote it all out exactly, you know, what it was and where it came from and all that. Mr. Geri from Freetown.
Mr. Gurney.
Yeah, so I have it all written out exactly
What it is.
and when, yeah.
Yeah. My father did one similar to this, not Scrimshaw, but just carving the little whale and the pin on the back. And my cat knocked it over and the tail broke. So I couldn't,
I have
Bring
some of
that.
the pieces that he did as well. Yeah, thank you.
there's a scene etched on that of the hunt, the whale hunt, with the whale boat and everything. Oh, I didn't talk about the food they had to eat. They ate something called hardtack, which was just flour and salt and water, and it was, and they cooked it, and of course it was very tough and chewy, and it was
Not good.
not good, and they would get mealyworms and I don't know how they survived that. I mean, they did, at first they brought a lot of food, fruits and vegetables, and they would stop along the way at islands and restock their supplies and everything. But once they were out there in the Arctic or, they had to survive on what they had. And it was a tough life. And, most of the whalers gave up. I think that Mr. Cudworth gave it up when he was 39, which to us is young, right? But, it was a tough life.
Did most of the whalers out of Nantucket and New Bedford, did they go to the South Seas? Did they stay? You were mentioning the Arctic, so I'm just wondering.
Wherever the whales were, wherever they were, they would spend days in water and not see a whale, for all those days, and then all of a sudden there'd be a whole pod of them. And that's when they would, there she blows, and everybody would get into position and go after the whale. I mean, it's sad that now certain whales are near extinction, and because they get tangled up in fishing line, and they are trying to make restrictions on on people, on the fishermen and what they can do. And but there have been fish from the North Pole right down to the South Pole, in Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, all around Hawaii, because whales are a warm-blooded animal. Their bodies take on the temperature of their environment. And so if they're in the winter, they're going to move to warmer places, okay? And so they'll move south near the equator, and then or come north to the equator from those areas there. And then that's when they would breed and have their babies. But then when the weather got warmer, hot, they would go back to the north, and they would take their babies with them. And well, by then they would be a year old or so, and because that's where the food was too, So
I guess they're getting a little more frequent around here.
yes, so are sharks. So be careful.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I don't know. About how long does a whale live?
Oh, they can live 80 years.
Really?
Yeah, they can live 80. I mean, the blue whale is the longest whale. That's 90, they can grow to 90 feet. And that's how I remember that they can live 80, 90 years,
And they usually have one baby at a time.
One baby at a time. Yeah, and they nurse their babies. Not like fish that lay eggs, and then as soon as they're born, they're off. Yeah. But, yeah.
Yeah, I just mentioned there's something called the International Whaling Commission, and it meets usually annually, and they set the quotas internationally of how many whales can be taken, of what species, but it's highly politicized. And that's why you see Japan, they are industrial captures of whales still.
Oh, yes.
And they have the subsistence captures, which are Eskimos, as you mentioned. But the International Whaling Commission and it's been around for about 50 years, that they have set these quotas. But it's scientific, but it's also quasi-political.
Yeah. I think at the turn of the century when inventions were being made, they had torpedo guns on the whale ships. They wouldn't even have to go out on a whale boat. They would just torpedo a whale and bring it in. And of course, the whales had little chance of surviving that. You know, they could aim and send the torpedo and blow it up, bring it back. You know, so, yeah. Any other questions? You're free to come up and look at anything.
Borrow the phone.
Any other questions at all? This was fascinating.